Well, thank you so much, Bob, for that generous introduction. I must say, it is really wonderful to be here today, um, at the essentially virtually at the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum, and being a part of this lecture series. It I will just introduce the topic with a little bit of a forward that I came to this topic several years ago as part of a study group at the Asian Arts Council, at the San Diego Museum of Art. And for me, it was an interesting experience simply because I suddenly found myself through, frankly, as an English speaker, confusion of names and people and places, blending of religious beliefs, but at the same time managed to glean a little bit of intellectual and spiritual character of Chinese painting in general. Um, it should be noted that this is far from a perfect presentation. In fact, the first time I gave it, I presented two artists. It works by what I presented as two separate artists, who at the end I was informed were in fact the same person with just different name spellings. So hopefully I have found all of those examples, and we can move on reasonably well. Okay. I will say also, just to start off, that painting is an ancient tradition in China, probably at least 3,000 years, going back beyond that to Paleolithic times. And the antiquity and continuity of that tradition absolutely rivals what we think of, what many of us are familiar with, and that is European painting traditions. It's remarkable. For the novice, the richness and diversity is not readily apparent. And I must say, I've chosen this image, and I'm going to try doing something here where I actually zoom in on this a little bit. It's a scroll that I think is just incredibly charming. In fact, it is a 11th century painting of a copy of a work from the 8th century, actually painted by Emperor Huizong, that shows women in daily activities. And I think what I like about this is that what it says about the nature of artists in China at this time, about 1,000 years ago, who had this fascinating view of creating lifelike images of daily life. So we see a group of women here who are, let's see if I can move a little bit to the left, who are processing newly spun, newly woven silk. And it tells us a lot about their daily life. It tells us, for instance, that there are children there as well as the workers, how they're dressed, what they're doing in the background. While it's all looks to be suspended in some nondescript space, there is a sense of space, simply because one figure is in front of the other, that the little girl is actually underneath the newly woven silk. So they're working with fairly just from a general observation, pretty sophisticated ways of presenting the world that are so different than what artists were doing in Europe at this time and other parts of the world. And let me just keep going here. I just love that painting and couldn't help spending a moment on it. There are a wide range of subjects in Chinese painting over millennia. Landscape, portraits, depictions of historical events, as you might expect. Just images from nature like this, of birds and flowers. We're really, in this talk, going to focus on landscape painting, just because it helps us sort of keep things tied together. And in fact, sort of what I'd like to really focus on is how this view of landscape and the world evolved in China into presenting some really interesting concepts that art historians have translated into the terms northern and southern schools of landscape painting. And before going too far, there's some more context to provide. Chinese landscape painting is what one would describe as a confluence of calligraphy and poetry. In fact, these are sort of described as the three perfections in general. And there's some belief and a discussion about calligraphy leading into painting. From what I'm reading more recently, painting was something that was evolving on its own, as well at least at the same time as, if not before, the development of calligraphy. But you can't help but see the connection between the two. And because calligraphy is by nature a handwritten practice, it reflects the personal qualities of the artist, if you will. And like a poem, it has a value that doesn't depend on its likeness to nature. Yet nature serves as the starting point for both a poem and for painting. And in the course of creating the work of art, often those are transformed into something new, some new idea, some new way of looking at the world, certainly from the artist's perspective. The character of the lines and forms created by the artist's brush accomplish that. That's how artists manage to create that something new out of just brush and ink. And we'll talk about this in a moment. It came to reveal something about the artist and about their mood at the moment it was created. We'll come back to this in just a moment, but it's important to note that the style of painting, what is depicted on the silk usually, reflects as much about the artist, at least, as about the place, and often nothing about a place. So a little bit of technique here. Almost all the works that we're going to see, I believe that's true, are created with simple brush and ink, black ink. We'll see very little color in these. It's fascinating to see how artists came to use brush and ink together to create so many different types of images on the silk. So this just lists some of the ways they do that. If you sort of going from the top, a fast speed, light pressure, you can get a small line. If you push down with medium pressure, you can get a thicker line or a really heavy line, or you can oscillate the pressure of the brush to get some interesting patterns, or use a little less ink, more wash, get a light pattern. You can even create in a single brush stroke a graduated color hints of darkness, going from dark to light, or even for the very talented artist, going from dark to light to dark again in a single brush stroke of the brush. It's really remarkable what they can create. And so in terms of approaching Chinese painting, it's always kind of interesting to take a moment just to look at how the artist was able to manipulate the in this case, ink, with that simple brush. And the result of that is art historians have looked back and come up with some vocabulary around describing the nature of the brushwork. And so we might, as we go forward looking at works of art, of these paintings, we might want to take a look and ask, do we see this type of painting that is sometimes described as an axe cut, where there's a sort of I would describe it as sort of often a diagonal line that comes down that looks like the end of an axe. There are definite corners to it. You can see that in the way this mountain is, the contours of this mountain are created just with a few simple axe cut brush strokes. We're often going to see vegetation, trees in particular, that are drawn with outlines that come to forms that are sometimes called crab claw. And you can see how that came together. And then often there are more complex designs. An example would be this one on the right with sort of hemp fiber. That is what's sometimes referred to, where you see hatch marks that all come together to help create a sense of shape and form, or even movement in the work. And we're going to span a pretty long period of time from the Tang Dynasty, which spanned from 1618 to 907, generally accepted as those dates. This was a time when China, the huge portion of what we call today China, was actually unified. And strong figure and landscape painting traditions were established during that time. It was also a time when Buddhism, in particular, a type of form of Buddhism described as Chan Buddhism, came into become popular, and we'll touch on that in a bit. Following that came the Song Dynasty, from about the end of the 10th century, 960, into the middle of the 12th century, or beginning of the 12th century, 1127. And this is a period when that art historians think of as the golden age of Chinese painting, when it really blossomed, so to speak. Now, there were really two broad classes or types of painters during these periods. One was a group of professional academic, what you might describe in Western terms as academic painters, who worked for the imperial court or other powerful individuals, wealthy individuals in the community. And these works had a particular style that we'll talk about in just a bit. The literati scholars, which we'll also define, were independent amateur painters who had been studying calligraphy, poetry, history, and decided to combine all those, as we said earlier, the combining of calligraphy and poetry to create a painting that presents some important concept that often was very personal to them. These become two separate ways of looking at painters throughout the rest of Chinese history. They rose up in the Song Dynasty. The following dynasty came when Mongols came from the north and took over control of China as a foreign power from about 1279 to 1368. At that time, they had their own form of administrators and people to control the country as a whole. And the literati, who had been the scholars who had been part of the Song Dynasty governments, were often sidelined and often retired out to the country. That influenced the landscape painting, as you might imagine. You'll see in time, but continued development of these forms of painting. And then we go into, that was replaced by the Ming Dynasty, which actually returns, not refined, sorry, refined Han Chinese traditions, because this was a return essentially of traditional Han Chinese power. There's a key person, an artist that we're going to speak about, Dong Qichang, who was a painter, writer, early art historian in the late Ming Dynasty, spanning the late 1500s into the early 1600s. And then we'll see a few works from the dynasty that follows this, the Qing Dynasty, that continued up into the 20th century. Okay. So let's go back and talk a little about literati. These were, as I said, scholars and amateur artists. They began to really become identified in the Tang Dynasty as a result of Confucianism. Confucianism was a study that respects authority, expects the government structure, leadership, from the emperor to local government leaders to families, the head of the household, the parents, children, controlled and determined a whole structure of life, including for government an educational system that emphasized literature and culture, as I said here. What developed over time was a series of civil examinations that people would take first in your local level, and if you did well there, it would give you an opportunity to work as an official at the local government level. You could take another exam that might get you, if you passed adequately, might get you into provincial, or even for the very best, imperial or state levels of government. So it was in an interesting experience, that came about because it allowed people to sort of rise up almost by their bootstraps at times into levels of power that they might not have otherwise had without that kind of system. So literati weren't trained in painting skills in a sort of traditional academic sense. That's what happened, for instance, at the imperial court, with painters who would have learned from their whole generationally, might have been skills have been passed along, almost in schools that mimic that are not unlike what happened in Europe and other parts of the world for royal courts that would have just identified artists to document who the rulers were and events that happened, present historical events, etc. So they were, the literati were not part of that group, but their work with calligraphy and study of history, study of culture, study of poetry, gave them enough confidence to create their own work, as we'll see. And these Confucian ideals led scholar artists to see calligraphy, poetry, painting, music, as a means of expressing one's personal thoughts and feelings. So if you look at this image here of the poet Li Po, you might think about, what do we know about this man? How does the artist convey who this man was? What's important about him? You look, for me, it's interesting that all the detail is in the face, in the head, as recognizing that this is someone who is a scholar, he has a cerebral, sort of thoughtful life. He's not looking at us, he's looking away, sort of up, as if he's lost in thought, lost in contemplation. The little bit of detail that we see in his body might be his arm that comes down, created just by 2 brushstrokes out of that profile, as if has his arms behind his back and he's looking maybe off in a distance. So with just a few brushstrokes, we can get a little bit of the sense of who this artist, of who this is being portrayed, and also I think to some extent how the artist felt about him. How it's as much the artist's interest in expressing his feelings about this person as it is about the person himself. But now it sort of reflects the purpose of landscape painting by the time that the Song dynasty is coming about. Really to show as much about who the artist was, and not so much to show about the place. Again, professional, imperial court, or those artists that were professionally trained often did create very detailed, reasonably lifelike reproductions of the natural world of a place or a time. But the literary artist was more interested in looking to nature and not show what the scenery was really like, but more their feelings about a place or a time or an idea. It's as revealing as the poem that they might have written about it, or the way that they actually write the poem calligraphically. So I'm going to come now to this artist from the Ming Dynasty, Dong Qichang. A little bit about him. He was a remarkable person. He passed his first, this would be the local prefecture level civil exam at age 12, something that was considered a remarkable thing. By 17, he had already passed the imperial civil exam, and by 35 was working at the highest level of work as part of that whole system, civil system. Over the course of his life, he became a collector, a critic, writer, a master painter. This is someone who was prolific in his writing, and so much so that his writing on Chinese painting continues to influence the art today. There are artists who continue to refer back to him. If you're familiar with art historians in Europe, he might be likened to Vasari, who was the Renaissance artist that wrote about the earlier Renaissance painters and sort of put them all into perspective, comparing one to the other, often in sort of a critical fashion. Certainly, Dong Qichang, in terms of world art, is one of the earliest of people that we might call an art historian. And he did something to classify painters by, largely speaking, grossly speaking, their styles, and I'll elaborate on that now. Oops, I've got a typo here, sorry about that. He actually classified painters into what he described as northern and southern schools. Now we get to the title of this talk. Northern schools of Chinese painting were more precise, more academic. These often came from professional or highly trained court painters. Though not that sort of early on, Southern school of Chinese painters would be more subjective, much freer in the way that they worked. Tended to be literati scholars, experts in calligraphy for personal expression. The North and the South, Northern and Southern, is not a geographic description, but a stylistic description. And it comes from Dong Qichang using Chan Buddhism and the two schools that grew out of that Chan grew into, actually, that were referred to as Northern and Southern schools. Again, not a geographic term, but more of a kind of term of practice, as we'll see in a moment. Each of the, in terms of Chan Buddhism, the North and the South variations are a reference to how enlightenment may be achieved. And that will take us into a little description about Buddhism for just a moment. And we will get to more paintings. So Chan Buddhism is in fact the form of Buddhism, I'll say this in a moment, that actually would evolve from Japan through Korea into Japan as Zen Buddhism. It gained importance during the Song Dynasty, so much so that Confucianism, actually, which was the dominant belief system at the time, sort of most powerful, had to rework itself. And it's in doing some reading back, it's almost, to me, there's a comparison, I think, to be made between how the Christian church in Europe, the Catholic Church in Europe, responded to the Reformation in the 1500s by sort of redefining itself. We call that the Catholic Reformation. Right. So meditation is, in this case, Chan Buddhism looked to meditation as a means to break through the illusions of ordinary reality. It was a belief that, if you're familiar with Buddhism, of course, Buddhism was originated in India around the teachings of a historical figure from the 5th century before the current Common Era, who found that the reasons for ending suffering in the world that might come, and his teachings sort of helped people with the idea was that you would lead to a point where you could break sort of the cycle of suffering in life through the teachings following his practices. It expanded from India over time into China, first introduced by a figure that is also a historical figure, an Indian monk whose name was Bodhidharma, who was what's described as the 28th in a series of master-pupil relationships that actually go back to the historical Buddha. And just for a second to take a break and look at this painting again. Once again, look at how this artist has, from the early 13th century, has created such a wonderful scene of a man crouching and shaping bamboo along what looks like maybe a shoreline with a forest and maybe some either tree here or maybe there's sand here, but doing all this just with simple brushstrokes of dark and lighter color, sort of tint, and a little bit of shading to give you a sense of shape of his body, but generally just the minimal amount of artwork, brushwork, to let you know what he's holding, what kind of plant this is, where he's located. It's just so powerful here, leaving so much up to us to fill in the blanks. So Bodhidharma on Chan Buddhism, that he taught that that Buddhism historically, going back to the beginning, became defined by a massive amount of scriptures, formal scriptures, official scriptures, dogma, dharma, that would guide individuals, written to guide people to their own enlightenment. But Bodhidharma proposed that through what they describe as a special transmission outside the scriptures, that even without depending on those words and letters, we have the potential in our human minds to see the innate nature of the world and in a sense become a Buddha or an enlightened one. And it is through the intimate teaching relationship between master and pupil that Chan Buddhism can transfer that knowledge from master to pupil. And that creates this patriarchal lineage of masters. So going back to the, again, historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama of this Shakyamuni clan, around in the 500s before the current Common Era, there were a series of students who became masters. The 28th in that line was Bodhidharma in the 6th century. He was considered to be the first Chinese patriarch, so it's not clear whether he really (29, 30, 31, 32), 32nd patriarch leading in this line of Chan Buddhism. And he was looking to find a pupil who might grow to become, in time, to become the master when he was gone. And so he put out a challenge in a classic, something almost like you'd see in a movie. Write a poem about enlightenment, challenging the community to tell them, how do you achieve enlightenment? And express this in the form of a poem. So Hong Zhen's pupil submitted the following poem. The body is the Bodhi tree. The mind is like a clear mirror. And at all times we must strive to polish it and must not let the dust collect. So a little reference here, the Bodhi tree is believed to be the tree under which the historical Buddha attained enlightenment. And it's through meditation and clear, keeping your mind clear of distraction, polishing it through mindfulness, that over time, not letting dust to collect, meaning other outside thoughts, that those pure meditative practices would lead you to an understanding, like as the Buddha achieved them, in your own path, on your own time. So that was his submission. Very traditional perspective of Buddhism at the time. But it turns out that there was a servant who decided of the patriarch who also submitted a poem unexpectedly. And it was that poem that stood out among the others. That the Bodhi originally has no tree. The mirror also has no stand. Buddha nature is always clear and pure. Where is there room for dust? But to be honest, I don't completely understand this poem, but apparently Hong Zhen, the patriarch, was extremely impressed and felt that what the meaning here was that essentially our Buddha nature is already there and it doesn't need to be purified. We have that within us. It only needs to be realized, and it's something that can happen spontaneously. And this is the one where the two sort of general schools of Chan Buddhism began to diverge. Northern school was continuing this in the path of traditional Buddhism, that it takes years and years, a lifetime of practice, and you would hope for it to achieve enlightenment. A mighty high task, a mighty high bar to pass in order to actually achieve enlightenment. Whereas the Southern school taught that we all have Buddhas within us, and enlightenment is something that can happen right away. Well, if you sort of think politically about this in terms of adoption of a particular religious belief, that's much more inviting to the rest of us who often don't have time to spend times at a monastery. So this developed into this whole notion that we have something inside us that can be readily expressed. As I mentioned, this would migrate to Japan as Zen Buddhism. So back to Dan Chichang again. He promoted this notion of the Southern school as a superior style because he found that there were some artists historically, going back to the Tang Dynasty even, who, and as he studied them and works that had been passed down through the centuries, he found that those artists were expressing more than just a representation of a place or a person or a time. That and they did that in a way that didn't represent, weren't necessarily naturally accurate representations of trees, mountains, rivers, but provided just enough information to convey that information, to convey that knowledge. This is sort of like a master and pupil in Buddhism who don't really exchange words to understand a concept of Buddhism, but it's just in living together, in being together, in working together. In time, there is a connection that happens, and the student becomes aware of what the teacher has been trying to express in the course of their whole life, not just their words. So how does this translate? It means that for many of these artists, you don't see a natural representation of something that if you looked out a window, and saw a mountain range, you wouldn't necessarily see these blank spots, right? Yes, there would be clouds, but he allowed these interesting forms, almost abstract forms, to be created in the meandering that you see throughout these paintings of the Southern School. They're often softer, subtler, and in fact, the abstraction alone has caused some Western art critics to look at Dong Qiang's ideas and suggest that some of his paintings and some of these others, the Southern School, are akin to what we think of today as modernist painters that began to develop in the 19th century, like works by Paul Cézanne, where he took a landscape and didn't try to express what he saw, create sort of a window to the natural world, but was expressing sort of his own feelings and thoughts about that world, in this case, through the use of color, of geometry, and very clearly shaped brushstrokes that convey a place, but in a completely novel way that is not tied directly to what the artist would have seen at that time. So here's an example by Li Cheng from the Tang Dynasty. And we see that it's a mountain landscape, type of landscape. Often these landscapes come in sort of three broad styles. This is one that's looking sort of up at the mountains in a vertical fashion at the peaks. And it invites you in through this river, under the bridge or over the bridge, into this little community where you can sort of meander with your eyes up into this settlement here that has a pagoda, or up back through the river to see a waterfall or a series of cascading waterfalls, leading you up through these lines to the mountaintop and mountains off in the distance. You often see these spaces of white where you don't really need the artist to tell you what's there. You know in your mind what this probably looks like. This is an example of a lot of detail trying to sort of present sort of ideas that are still related to other religious beliefs like Taoism. Taoism often it brings in issues or thoughts about the nature of the world, that we are at once all part of the same Qi, but we have opposites as well. And often in paintings you'll see the opposites of mountains and rivers, which on one hand are completely different, but on the other hand, you can't have mountains without rivers, right? It's the rivers that shape the mountains, and it's the mountains that cause the rivers to take their own form as they come down. They're inextricably linked together. These are the kind of ideas that these artists are expressing as well, but they're doing it in a way that's more controlled and deliberate. We still see brushwork like the crab claw on the trees. You'll see some formations of axe cut, and certainly lots of patterns around, as we've seen before. So if this is an example of Northern School, where there's still ideas, the artist is capturing ideas that go beyond just what you physically see. This is a fan that's been painted by Dong Qichang himself, of orchids, fungus, and rock. And it's a part of the collection at the San Diego Museum of Art. And what I think is just, again, wonderful, as I've seen, as I pointed out earlier, how we can see that there is rock here. There is a fungus growing on the rock, and there are these lovely orchids. But if you took just the lines themselves, it's hard to know that if you had looked at just one section here, if that was really an orchid. It's when it all comes to pulls just a few lines together, a few brushstrokes together, that you can begin to recognize, I see the orchid growing here. And at that point, the artist leaves it up to us to fill in the details of that based on our own experience in nature. So this is where nature is influencing but not defining what we actually see physically in the painting. As I mentioned, in the Southern School, Dong Qichang actually went back in time and looked at works from earlier artists, and a couple of those are what I'm going to show next. Wang Wei is an artist that was a poet and painter, considered to be one of the greatest artists of the Tang Dynasty. And looking back historically, Dong Qichang said, you know what, he falls more in the Southern School because there's a subtlety, there's a quietness about his work. It turned out that we don't have any paintings. The paintings by Wang Wei himself no longer exist. But there is a tradition in Chinese art, in Chinese art in general, of honoring the past. This again goes back to a Confucian notion of honoring one's parents, one's ancestors, and recognizing the value of their work, copying it literally as a way of honoring that work, and then in time adding your own bit of innovative style to it. But it's still sort of coming out of the inspiration by that work. So what we have remaining are works like this, that was painted by an artist in the style of Wang Wei. It turns out that at the time there were some carvings that Wang Wei had actually done that did exist. Unfortunately, we don't have any of these, I guess, today. But so this is looking backwards. Dong Qichang recategorized or began to put labels on, as an art historians do, on those earlier artists. Another artist that was working in the manner of Wang Wei was Wang Shimin from the Qing dynasty. And this is getting closer to the 20th century. But you can see here how he has expressed a landscape scene, again, of a mountain, which has water flowing through it, clouds in the distance. We can follow waterfalls coming down, shaping that mountain, seeing a little human settlement. But the shapes that the artist has used here that are said to be inspired by Wang Wei's style of painting are not really how you would see a mountain, but actually create a sense of the upward thrust of this mountain, of how the mountains come up out of the earth in such powerful fashions. Looking at the power of that, surrounded by the softness of the trees and the softness of the water. Again, this whole idea is of comparing, juxtaposing soft and hard, light and dark, to create these wonderful, wonderful forms and landscapes. There's a little bit of color here, maybe even, but and here Dong Qichang has himself a painting by Dong Qichang himself. Continues in that style of these, what I sort of think of as rounded bands of forms that aren't really what you see most of the time. I mean, you certainly can see some pathways which lead you in. The shape of the trees are meandering. All of these have symbolism that at the time would have been significant, even today, for those who are more familiar with the symbolism of these objects, are meaningful. And you have to spend time just looking at these works. So up in the distance, there's a little settlement up here in the mountains. How important is that? It may be important. It may remind you of something that you've seen in your life. Another artist from the past during the late Song period or late Tang period was Dong Yuan. He is sometimes referred to as the founder. You know, there are a lot of people who've written about this. they would suggest that you can see from this style of painting who the person was. Well, and so here's sort of the overall painting of these tend to be, this is another form of landscape painting that you see, that rather than the vertical sort of mountains going up, it's broad views of a long landscape. And often you'll find gatherings of individuals. If you can see my cursor here coming through, and generally these are paintings that are read from right to left, as you would read Chinese language from right to left or up down. And you can sort of follow along to see people gathering, people in a boat, people actually with managing a fishing net, another fisherman out here. And we'll see some more examples of this in just a moment. Another artist that is often referenced by later artists is Mi Fu from the Song Dynasty. He collected a lot of antique works. Again, unfortunately, Mi Fu's work does not survive. But the good news is that other artists who from centuries ago did see his work, Dong Qiang being one of them, and have painted works that are in the style of Mi Fu. So here's another Dong Qiang painting, and I just find astonishing in its abstraction. Yes, there's a clear scene here of water in front of us, looking at a shoreline with water going into a little settlement, a little path coming up, or that goes up to another settlement off in the distance. These towering mountains that sort of stack one on the other, giving us telling us that there is visual space here, but not in the way that Western artists, European artists would have created the sense of perspective off into the distance. The brushwork is simple, is repetitive, so you get these patterns like that hemp pattern. Sometimes these probably have specific names as well, so that he didn't bother to distinguish exactly how this peak differed from that peak. He just told us that there are staggered peaks going off into the distance. That's all we needed to know to begin to build the picture, the image of this in our own minds. So distinguishing North and South. The Northern School artists, generally speaking, were working for more powerful patrons in the imperial court. On the other hand, the literati artists painted it as a form of personal expression as part of the Southern School. And there are two schools that I'm going to show examples of next that reflect the Northern School is the Ji School, and the Southern School, the Wu School. This is just some reflection by the 20th century, actually contemporary artist. He's still living. We have works of, we had an exhibition of his work at the San Diego Museum of Art, Pan Gongkai. He offers some guidance that these are decisively different, although sometimes, honestly, I think it's a little tough. In terms of visual expressions, the Ji School's brush and ink appears to be more expressive and flamboyant. I think I sort of read that as detailed. And whereas the Wu School, the Southern School, favors subtlety. It's giving you the impression of something, but without really knocking you over the head with it. How do you distinguish expressiveness from subtlety? I mean, this is one of the challenges, and that is, he says that has to do with value. So the Wu School's brush and ink was artists are encouraged to present a state of personal contemplation. The style is a little more scholarly, cultured, not so much perfection as an artist. It was intended to lead to a richer spiritual life, be more spiritually connected than sort of a secular natural world connection, and was viewed as, Dong Qiang would say, this is much more cultured. So here's an example of the Ji School. This was a conservative painter from the Ming Dynasty, actually, because this categorization of Northern and Southern School artists continued into the Qing Dynasty, to some extent into the 20th century. Over time, as you can imagine, one generation after another, their there were artists who said, you know what, I'm going to pull a little bit from this, a little bit from that, and things get a little bit muddied later. But at this point, this is work by an artist, Dai Jin, who's considered the founder of this Xi school that was centered around a particular location in the Xinjiang province in China. There are a couple of artists that also followed this as well, but just these are works. Here's an example of more of a contemplative landscape with a single figure who is just sitting under this tree in the wonderfully inspiring distance of these mountains and mist and water. So there is a school that's called Majia that is came about with the two artists Ma Yuan and Jia Chui. I apologize for my pronunciation. These are artists from the Southern Song Dynasty, not to be confused with the Southern style of school of painting. They created these were artists who often create works that create a sense of limitless space. So they're showing here sort of everyday life along a pathway along the banks of a river or lake, and you can see the precise work here, that this axe cut depiction of these rocks, and the sides of the road, and the way that the details of the tree are much more intense than you might have seen in a Southern school work. Similarly here, an artist who's looking out over an abyss with a waterfall off in the distance. It's a misty day. We don't know what's back here. That's left to us to think about and contemplate. Presumably, this is what the gentleman here, who's drawn with a fair amount of detail. Even, let me see if I can zoom in just a little bit. Look, there's even a little bit of color here. That's pretty remarkable. And this one is just hard to beat. The composition itself, in and of itself, is so wonderful. How we have the gentleman standing on a shore or along a path, looking off into the distance. That along, let's see, how does my cursor end up here? Along in the distance, his gaze is sort of mimicked by this branch that's just below him and going off into the mist. The way that the path goes off in the same direction, that diagonal line that's created, gives you a sense of movement. The big branch that goes over his head, arches over his head, certainly leads us forward. And what do we see there? We see a little bird sitting on a branch, and maybe a companion bird who's flown away. Does that reflect what the gentleman is seeing or thinking about? Is that what's keeping his attention? What he has on his mind? Maybe he's thinking about a relationship that he's had where he's been left behind and someone has gone down the path ahead of him. You can go all over the place with this. Great. These landscapes were often created on scrolls, and this is described as a hand scroll. These often are not very tall, but extremely wide. At the museum, we have some examples that are up to 90 feet long, that are just amazing. They tell a story. In this case, that one tells the story of an individual empress empress who is in a procession that was painted simply to promote her as a leader. In this case, it's described as a pure and remote view of streams and mountains from the 13th century. And I'm just going to walk us through this from right to left to show how there's actually, it's almost the equivalent of watching a short movie about a place and feelings over time. So we start here in a sort of simple space with some rocks and trees. We move along through, if you look along the top, we move along through a more dense cluster of trees where there are people and a settlement. Looks like a beautiful settlement with multi-level homes there or buildings there. And all within this, flanked by these beautiful landscapes. In this case, there are a few boats on the left leading us off into some fishing boats on the, I'm sorry, the few boats on the right leading us over through the water to some fishing boats. And finally come to the shore again with impressive rocks and landscape with trees guiding us along to think about this particular place. It's starting from right to left. It's an amazing expression of a time and place. So the Wu School is considered a Southern school. An example of that is Shenzhou, from a period that I believe is the Ming period, right, of fishermen. And on the left is the full hanging scroll, again, another form of landscape painting that is showing some activity here of a fisherman who's just coming off the shore, going out. There's some birds ahead of him, and off in the distance are some trees, and that on the right is a blow up or expansion of the fisherman going along. And it doesn't. These are the human representation in these works are tiny and small, again reflecting the notion that of these scholars that humans' place in the world is relatively speaking a small one, but it is a place where we live. So we're part of that. We're just only one part. And then Zhou Zhen is a scholar. This is a work from our museum. I think I mentioned, I presented this early on, of the scholars conversing on a bridge. And one of the things that I really love about this is what the artist has done just above the scholars on the bridge. You'll notice how that there's a tree line, but we don't actually see the tops of the trees. We do see the trees closer to us, but we don't see those distant trees, but we know that they're there, right? So again, it's a way of creating a sense of distant space going up into these mountains, where we have to fill in the rest of the details. And then there's this community that presumably they're walking towards off to the left. Right, and here's the detail. And another fan painting by one of the what's considered to be one of the greats of the Southern School, Wen Shimen, called "Landscape with Lake Bridge and Fisherman." And this is one that I think is just delightful. The landscape, because it's on a fan, it sort of tilts. The building on the little building on the right is not in the same linear space as the lake. You would think the lake would be pouring into those little houses, but because it's on a fan, that kind of makes some sense. So the artist is not caring about keeping that natural perspective that we might see in European art. He's painting to fit the space for his work, and more important is to see the density and intimacy of the living space, and then the solitary fisherman on his own in this body of water, in this spectacular space, with in the distance straight ahead, maybe some additional settlement identified only by a couple of lines that might represent rooftops. This is just so incredibly, in some ways, I can't help but think about it as something that in Western art we didn't really develop until the 19th century. Again, this is a Scholar Under the Pine. It's a Ming Dynasty work. It's from an oval fan. You can see the scholar depicted very simply, looking out into the distance. And then this is a long scroll that's really long from our museum, called Life of a Fisherman Along a River. And we see different aspects of life. So starting from the right, we're going to see people gathering their things and coming out into the river to do some net fishing. As they move along, we see a little island where someone is doing some fishing with a pole, and going to the left, we see there's some people who are just relaxing on the river on a boat that has a little shade, while another people are next to them. We see that there are other people like that who are moving along to the other shore, where there are people having a big picnic. So sort of presenting daily life, telling a story. There's a narrative here, sort of as you might expect in a poem. And I'm going to end with two works by Huang Shen, both from the museum. You see how this would be considered Southern school. Just the minimal detail provided to tell you what these snowy mountains are like. That here, the ink has been used not for the sky, but for the land and the snow-covered land. And the details that I think are just so fantastic. If you think about brush and ink, if you can see how even where the trees, which are depicted as just simple brush strokes, are in front of the distant sky, he's left a little bit of space so that you don't get the trees blending in. They're distinct from that space. How he has mastered the application of ink with the brush on that silk is just astonishing. And I will finish with this work, also by Wang Shen, from 1755, of Sailing in the Mist. And there's a poem here. I wish I knew what the words were to the poem. It's something good. It would be great to do some research on. This is a work that I've only recently discovered in our museum's collection. How he's depicted the sky with these big brush strokes, wet brush strokes to create variation. The trees on the shore are made fast, and then there's this little depiction of the fisherman in his boat, created with the minimum number of lines. This was painted in 1755. The same time in France, artists were depicting lush, lavish, rococo, exuberant, excessive detail paintings of aristocratic life with color and splash, very fine detail. I can't imagine what a Rococo French artist, Watteau, for instance, might have thought about this painting. My guess is he would have scratched his head and said, never mind, and completely missed the point. Just a fantastic piece. So with that, I will conclude and say that I approach this as a blank slate, hoping to have a Southern school experience of Southern Enlightenment, but it's for me been more of a Northern school experience of gradual understanding. And I hope that you've achieved a little bit of enlightenment about Chinese painting as well in the course of it. And as a postdoc, I had an interaction with the former curator of Asian art at the San Diego Museum of Art, because I've got a hard time really getting to this North and South concept. I found a number of written sources that explain what it isn't, but not necessarily what it is. So I asked her, and what she did was she basically just held her hands out and then walked away in the opposite direction. So maybe that's what a pupil should get from a master. That from her, I should get some silent response and try to figure it out on my own. So that's what we're left with. And with that, I will thank you. And I will stop sharing.
Yeah. David, may I say, speaking for everyone here, I'm sure I am speaking for everyone here, that we found this to be just a wonderfully comprehensive program, and we all feel as though we're just a little bit closer to being able to understand Chinese art than we were before. I do want to point out that we do have an exam that everyone's going to be getting, and we do mark on a curve, and so you guys had better be ready. I'm just kidding, of course, about that. David, you know, I wanted to ask you a question. Do you have something that would combine the best of, say, the almost magical triad in Chinese art of calligraphy, artistic expression, and poetry?
Well, I do have one more slide that I can share that starts to get at that. I was concerned it was getting a little long. Let's see, we go here.
I think we have a little bit of time. We can go along. It's just 11:07. I think we can go along for maybe 10 more minutes or so, and we'll also entertain questions from people in the audience if there are any.
So this is a wonderful work that's in the Metropolitan Museum of fishermen. And what you'll notice is that, as I've referenced before, there's a poem actually inscribed on the work. And we have a very simple depiction of the lone fisherman here on next to the shore. Well, the calligraphy itself becomes sort of part of the art. I mean, look how the style of calligraphy mimics the style of the painting itself. I look to this line of calligraphy and the oar that the fisherman is holding, or the leaves of grass coming out, the shape of the shapes, brushwork that creates the shape of the tree, not so different than the calligraphy. So that actually sort of ties calligraphy with the painting, if you will. And then I do have a translation for this, and that's red leaves west of the village reflect evening rays. Yellow reeds on a sandy bank cast early moon shadows. Lightly stirring his oar, thinking of returning home, he put aside his fishing pole and will catch no more. So this is just about enough to make me go and take a class in reading Chinese, which I might actually be the next level of school I might begin to be getting too old for. But it really is, you can see how this just enriches this even more than the calligraphy sort of matching the brushwork. But the concept he's describing in this poem tells us about this figure here and about the artist. That helps.
David, that's beautiful. And I have a next question that's going to segue right into this. I'm counting, I think I counted 19 different seal marks on this particular work. When we buy a Western piece of art, we put it under glass because we wouldn't want to touch it. We wouldn't want to ever alter it. We stick it on a wall, and then friends might come over and look at it in the background. The Chinese traditional art experience is completely different from that. It's more immersive and it's more integrative. Could you address that for a second?
Yeah, I do have actually another work. This comes from a fantastic book called How to Read a Chinese Painting. It's put out by the Metropolitan Museum. And they provide this wonderful example of what is considered to be one of the, of course, this is the Metropolitan Museum saying this, but considered one of the great paintings ever in art of this steed, this majestic horse that was painted in the 8th century. But what we see is that it has a good deal of inscription, and it's just littered with stamps. So they actually tell us a little more about who did these stamps. For example, the stamp number 1 was actually the Southern Tang Emperor Li Yu from the 10th century. So while this is 200 years after this painting was created of this horse, the emperor himself actually acknowledged how impressed he was with it by putting his stamp on it around the 10th century. And then the artist who I mentioned earlier, Mi Fu, saw this work as well in the 11th century later. He put his very modest stamp here on the work. Then this continues over time. And by the time of the Qing dynasty, the emperor there goes bananas. He stamps all of these yellow stamps, number 12s, are referencing a stamp of the emperor Qianlong from the 18th century. So he has littered, literally, the work just to prove how impressed he was with it. The inscriptions are not all from the artist also. If you take a look at this, the little inscription here is by that Tang emperor. So he put his stamp on it. This is early on, before before the Qing emperor had a chance to mess it up. My interpretation, before he had a chance to acknowledge it. So the Southern Tang emperor in the 10th century wrote a nice inscription about it along with his stamp, his chop. Mi Fu actually wrote just a single character here with his stamp. But the Qing emperor himself had a lot to say, apparently. So he wrote some things here, he wrote some things over here. he in addition to stamping, he had quite a bit to inscribe. So this was all about respecting and acknowledging the value of this work, and is another way of in which culturally there was honor and respect given to this work by Han Gan centuries and centuries later. Does that help?
Oh, yeah, so one would sit and one would meditate in front of a painting of this nature, and one would come up with a small poem, and one would feel that inscribing that poem on the work of art would actually be a compliment to the entire process. And so
ultimately,
it's littered with the seals and with poems over the centuries. You know, this painting also has something else, David. It has something that was not in any of your other works. It has a horse. And the Chinese use traditionally the horse as a metaphor, the celestial steed, and the magnificent superior steed is a metaphor for a magnificent superior person. So I wonder if you could show us something about that.
right. This is of course a wonderful example from the Met. I found another, just reading through another book on Chinese painting. I found works by Zhu Beihong, which I'm probably mispronouncing as well, called Galloping Horse. He did a lot of works in the 20th century of horses in various forms. He actually was not only trained in China in the early 20th century, he actually spent some time in Paris in the early 20th century, training there, and learned classical, traditional academic European painting as well. So this is an artist who returned to China and continued working in traditional fashion there. The horse is of course, actually, as I understand it, horses are thought to have been first developed and domesticated in Mongolia, in sort of northern parts of China, so that it has a long and deep tradition of representing power of the owner of, and even sometimes likened to a dragon in terms of importance and symbolism. But while I found this, I have to say, this is just a personal note, and stumbling across this, I couldn't help but think about a scroll that my parents bought while we were in Singapore. And this has been hanging in my my parents' living room for as long as I can remember. This horse running towards some bamboo with a poem that, again, I have lived with forever, and we've lived with forever, and I have no idea what this says. We should really need to, I should be asking Xia Wei, I think, or someone, Lily Birmingham maybe. But I was struck by the similarity between these two works, and I just made this connection in the last day or so. And my guess is that this is more of a traditional image than I might be aware of. But this also, because I believe this work was bought in Singapore, Zhu actually lived in Singapore for a period of time painting works like this. It may be that there's some connection between the two. I don't know. But horses are powerful images in Asian art in general, and actually in world art. If you go around the world, the horse is a powerful symbol.
David, this has just been a wonderful morning, and I'm thinking back to one of our trainers when we were doing our docent work at the San Diego Museum of Art, and she was a brilliant woman and very insightful. And she said, forget about that expression, I know what I like. She said, it's the opposite. It's you study something and then you like what you know.
Yeah.
You like what you know. And so you have a little knowledge and suddenly it becomes your favorite topic. And do you think? What do you think?
This has been my docent experience, is every time we would start a new study section, whether it was East Asian or Southeast Asian or 18th, 19th century or Renaissance, as soon as we learned a little bit about this particular painting, you had the opportunity to look and actually have just a little bit of an understanding about what you were looking at, that would lead you to something else and lead you to something else. And that's the fun of it. It's like travel. It's like going to a new place or meeting a new person and discovering things about them. It's been a great experience for me, and definitely true. When I hear, on tours, we often will hear, well, I know what I like. And I like to think that by the time there people are done with our tours at the museum, Bob, that people like a little bit more than they maybe came in with.
A lot more. Well, in representing the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum, I want to thank everyone for attending this morning, and certainly I want to thank David Miles, who's done this wonderful job. And we'll look forward to seeing everyone in a couple of weeks when we're going to hear the talk from the Huntington Museum in San Marino. And you folks can all take off at this point and enjoy the rest of your weekend. And a few of us are going to stay behind to chat about how things went today. Okay, and again, thank you all for attending.
Thank you.